Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from The Black Dog, Sleep Deprivation. Okay, here we go with yet another Black Dog album. Their 5th over the course of the past 2 years alone, and now their 20th main album overall. You can find the links to my reviews of their previous 3 albums, which as of now are The Grey Album, My Brutal Life, and Other Like Me, all in the description. Though I've been covering every new album they've released since I started this channel in proper videos, this being my 9th video on them to date. I've always been committed to covering them this extensively since they have long been on that mental list of bands and artists I want to do discography reviews of someday. I feel like the story and progression of their career, especially through the first 10 albums, which I haven't yet done videos on, is really interesting and deserves to be covered further in depth in that way. With that said, as they've gotten so much more prolific, I do feel like I'm finding less and less new things to actually say. Not that their newest stuff hasn't been of quality, it definitely has. Even at their worst, you're guaranteed to get some solid brooding techno or immersive dark ambience, and I'd argue their catalog doesn't have any true duds. The closest we came to that was the merely okay Post-Truth and Black Daisy Wheel albums from 2018, and all the others range from good to great, with a couple of excellent ones or even personal all-time favorites sprinkled around, like Silenced, Spanners, Music for Real Airports, Radio Scarecrow's getting up there too. But I will say their last album, Other Like Me, did leave me at maybe a bit of a crossroads on how much I felt like I had it in me to keep covering them in proper videos. That album, while again up to their usual standards and featuring a remarkably personal and relatable mental health-centered concept to theme itself around, in terms of the actual music was just exactly what I would have expected out of any new album of theirs, without anything really special that stood out about it in the greater context of their catalog. I could have very easily compressed my thoughts on that one into a Some Stuff I Miss segment. When someone puts out as much work as these guys have been putting out lately, they can run the risk of exhausting their more casual audience and devaluing their work to them, getting people less excited for when a new album does come up. But if you choose not to use a comeback from a length of time away as a means to get people's attention, you just need to make sure that there's a different reason for people to pay attention. In my opinion, the most effective way to do that is to make sure new albums are distinct from each other and that each one has something to it that other ones don't have. And to be fair, I don't think the Black Dog have been ignoring that principle or mindlessly grinding for their recent output either. All these new albums have had different concepts and themes and points of inspiration, be it Other Like Me's mental health theme, or the Grey album themed around references to the Human League, or Music for Airport Lounges, which is exactly what it says on the tin. But concepts and themes are one thing and execution is another. Ever since Radio Scarecrow, they have definitely stuck to a certain kind of sound and formula, switching off between techno and ambient projects, all of a similar downbeat and brooding tone. And while I do think there is enough differences in actual musical execution to make the vast majority of their albums feel distinct, I think they found a way to keep their sound feeling fresh this whole time. Those differences can be pretty subtle, and not all of them pull it off. And I would definitely get it if you were looking in from the outside and found their work really tedious or something. And sometimes the strategy of changing things up just doesn't matter at all. Ironically, my easy favorite of the albums they put out in the last couple of years, My Brutal Life, didn't really have a special concept to it that they hadn't already done before, or anything special about the execution that would make it stand out on paper. They just kind of got down to the core of what made both sides of their formula work and got it to emotionally connect with me in a way that other albums of theirs didn't to the same degree. I don't know, I don't mean to frame this as like advice, as like I would know any better. There's not really any right or wrong way to roll out albums. But anyway, it does appear for this latest album they're going with the strategy of trying some new ideas within their usual framework. Sleep Deprivation is obviously based off the pair of tracks that showed up on Music for Real Airports, also to which a 3rd installment was released on Music for Airport Lounges, and a 4th installment called Sleep Deprivation Holiday was included on their Music for Dead Airports EP. All relevant to mention, since not only are those 4 tracks also included on this album as bonus tracks tacked onto the end of the download on Bandcamp, the core of the album is structured as a lengthy multi-part suite, of which those 4 tracks are technically the first 4 movements, hence why the tracks are labeled as starting with Part 5. Now, based off the promise of the old Sleep Deprivation tracks they'd released before, I had a certain kind of expectation that this was going to be a lot of brooding and heavy ambient drones. And it was. The album is in fact entirely 100% ambient. But also the tone of it was not entirely what I expected either. There's a lot more melody in these mixes, and there's a lot more tracks that have a lot more of an uncharacteristically pleasant feel to them. Some of these tracks could credibly pass for, I don't know, Stars of the Lid or something. And that alone was pretty dang interesting, had me pretty intrigued on my first listen of this thing, which, by the way, was a while back, since they sent me an advance copy. Also turned out to be an unfortunately appropriate mood as an American right about now. The time was right for an album about sleep deprivation to show up when it did. Though as intriguing as my first impressions of this album were, it was also an album that the longer I sat with it, the less effectively it hit for me. It's still a good album that serves the very purpose it set out to achieve, while including a handful of really strong standouts. But it's also a very long album, consisting mostly of very empty-sounding drone pieces, and that is definitely going to be an acquired taste. Maybe not the kind of thing I can put on all the time. 70 minutes over 17 tracks may not seem like that much of a commitment. Most Black Dog albums have a lot of tracks and sit around an hour without me ever noticing it. But I was really feeling the length on this project more than I typically do with their stuff. Especially if you try to include the bonus tracks on the end, which brings the total length up to an hour and a half. I'd actually kind of recommend skipping the bonus tracks. They're all better enjoyed in their original contexts. Now, I will say the album does start out really strong. Like, the best part of this album for me is the first two tracks. Sleep Deprivation 5, the slow cancellation of the future, is such a light and fluttery arrangement of plinking melodic synths that slowly surround themselves with warmer pads. There's a consistent sense of movement. The piece feels well layered and dynamic while also feeling very still and meditative. Evokes the feeling of looking down at the earth from space or looking up at the stars and contemplating the insignificance of our existence as humans. And immediately following that with part 6, The Future is Now the Past, a piece that has much more of a symphonic quality to it, made out of synths that seem to imitate string and brass sections, almost feeling like a romantic movie soundtrack piece. I never would have expected a track like this to come out of the Black Dog. Right off the bat, this opening had me really excited for the level of creativity that might be shown on this project. Although, for the most part, the rest of the album focuses much more on the kind of monolithic and heavy drones I already would have expected going into this for the first time. Not to say those drone pieces don't still hit. Other highlights include Part 7, Generic Protocols, which kinda maintains the denser, spacey vibe of the first two cuts, albeit with more standard synth blends and singular snaps of percussion, or Part 11, The Failure of Modernity, delivering a similar idea to that cut with more of a chilling and still open emptiness I found alluring. You also got Part 12, Airport 3, getting a bit more well-layered and dynamic with its melodic textures. Part 13, Core Planning, has some more emotional melodic progressions that give me similar vibes to something like Aphex Twin's Rhubarb or Lichen, albeit ever so slightly harsher and stodgier. Part 14, REM Kiss, has a constant buzzing drone and some mildly symphonic feeling major key synth pads floating around it that I found really nice. Part 16, Null, has more pads that feel like strings and choirs, adding up to one of the marginally harsher darkwave-ish arrangements here, alongside some menacing buzzing chords near the end. And the album does have a nice closer as well in Part 21, Internal Sunrise, that has more shifting and pleasant emotional paths that sufficiently feels like a close-up resolution to the journey this whole album took you on, feeling like finally reaching the light at the end of a long dark tunnel. But it seems for every cut on here that hits for me, there's another fairly standard drone piece that doesn't really stick out to me one way or the other. I guess Part 8, Stockhausen, was right, and Part 9, Consumer Tethering, have more rhythmic blinking synths that has an interesting texture to set themselves apart from the rest of the track listing. Part 10, New Time's End, has some humming melodic paths that give me a little bit of a Blade Runner soundtrack vibe too. Part 17, Deep Isolation, had more pensive buzzing drones and synths that sort of resemble pianos. And Part 19, Human Latch, has a warmer and more comforting tone to its paths that briefly gets a bit more epic and expansive near the end. Though none of these tracks are particular standouts to me. They're all pretty liable to fall in the background without leaving as much of an impression as I'd like. And especially once we get to the album's second half, we start running into tracks like Part 15, Agency, Part 18, Shuggy, or Part 20, Flotation, which feel like they're just running through ideas we've already heard elsewhere on the album without really doing them any better than those other cuts, or even occasionally presenting them in a more sour and unpleasant manner that's less enjoyable to immerse myself in. Not to mention these cuts all start to sit around the 5-minute mark, which may not look like much on the surface, but really start to add up when you put them all together. Can really lead this whole second half of the album to feel like it's just dragging on and starting to border on tiresome. Although at the same time, I do have to acknowledge that just because tracks don't stand out to me doesn't mean they don't serve their purpose. Especially in the context of an ambient album like this, literally called Sleep Deprivation, where the experience is actively designed to run together and set up this singular vibe that can induce that sleepy feeling in you. Not every track needs to have an interesting idea going into it for this kind of album to work. I mean, I had similar feelings when I reviewed the much longer-winded and even more monolithic Stars of the Lid album and Their Refinement to the Decline a while back. That's often considered one of the best ambient albums ever made. This album could theoretically hit a similar kind of note for people as a project like that. Probably not picking up the same amount of emotional weight as that one does. That's going to be a ridiculously high bar to live up to for some people, and I wouldn't necessarily go in expecting it to be that easily comparable. But, you know, it does still effectively hit on more of a strong emotional note than most Black Dog albums are able to, balancing out their usual darker brooding with lighter and more reassuring and vulnerable moments. I do think this is a better album than either Other Like Me or Music for Airport Lounges. There's definitely something you can get out of this album that you can't get out of other earlier Black Dog albums. But I do have a personal preference towards ambient records that can give me more substance when I do actively pay attention over ones that just set a singular vibe and stick to it. And in that way, this is not their best or most engaging entirely ambient record. Obviously, the original Music for Real Airports pretty handily outclasses it, and I don't know if they're going to be able to repeat the idea behind that album in a way that actively improves upon what that one did first at this point. But I'd even argue that an earlier album of theirs, like Music for Photographers, kind of delivers similar ideas to what this album does, with much better pacing and sonic variety, too. That album's roughly equally as long, but I think it did a much better job of retaining my attention without ever feeling like it dragged to the extent that certain stretches of this album could. I don't know. At the end of the day, Sleep Deprivation is another good album from the Black Dog. I think there's a fairly easy case to be made for other people calling this one of their strongest in a long time. It's just not one of my own new favorites from them. It's kind of lower middle tier in the grander context of their catalog for me. And I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.